In the autumn of 1798, 17 travelers vanished along a 20-mile stretch of the Wilderness Road in southeastern Kentucky. They disappeared without a trace, no bodies, no witnesses, only abandoned horses and scattered belongings, silent clues to a mystery that would haunt the frontier for generations. But what makes these disappearances truly terrifying isn't just their number. It's that every official record of the investigation that followed was deliberately buried by local authorities. For more than 2 centuries, the truth about what really happened near the Harden family farm remained sealed away, hidden inside forgotten court files, until a chance discovery in 1987 revealed one of the darkest chapters in early American history. Those records described a killing operation so calculated, so meticulously disguised as Christian charity, that it operated undetected for 8 long years. Before we continue with the shocking story of the farm that became Kentucky's first house of horrors, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover secrets powerful families tried to erase forever. And drop a comment below, tell us what state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. The discovery that would eventually expose the Harden family's crimes didn't begin with screams in the night, but with a routine act of housekeeping in a dusty courthouse basement. Southeastern Kentucky in 1798 was a place caught between civilization and wilderness, a rough, beautiful land that promised prosperity to anyone brave enough to claim it. Thousands of settlers were pushing westward, following the narrow trail carved through the Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone just 2 decades earlier. The Wilderness Road had become the main artery of America's frontier expansion, stretching for hundreds of miles through unforgiving mountains and forests. A single misstep could mean death, from exposure, wild animals, or the countless human predators who stalked the trail. Yet, along this dangerous route, small settlements began to bloom like wildflowers after rain, outposts of hope scattered across the wilderness. These communities served as lifelines for weary travelers, offering food, rest, and news from the world they'd left behind. The town of Millfield was one such place, a tiny settlement of just 300 souls perched at a bend where the road dipped into the fertile valley of Beaver Creek. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Founded in 1794 by a group of devout Virginia Baptists seeking religious freedom, Millfield was a town where faith ruled life. Sunday attendance was mandatory, and strict moral codes governed everything, from drinking to dancing. At the heart of the community stood Hendrick's General Store, a weathered log building that doubled as the trading post, meeting hall, and courthouse. Its owner, Jeremiah Hendricks, was a gruff ex-militiaman who'd once fought beside Daniel Boone himself. He ran the store with the kind of authority that made men listen and stocked everything a traveler could need: gunpowder, salt, whiskey, blankets, and rumors from the world beyond the mountains. Across the road stood the Cumberland Inn, the pride of the settlement. A 2-story structure run by Martha Crane, a widow from Philadelphia who'd built the finest accommodations between Lexington and the Virginia border. Her inn offered a hot meal, a clean bed for 2 bits a night, and the kind of polite conversation that reminded travelers of civilization. Millfield's spiritual heart was the New Jerusalem Baptist Church, a modest log chapel that could hold the entire population on a Sunday. Its pastor, Reverend Ephraim Cole, was a Harvard-educated minister who had traded Boston comfort for frontier hardship. His sermons mixed theology with survival advice, giving settlers both faith and practical wisdom in a hostile land. And among Millfield's most respected residents were the Hardens, Ezekiel, his wife Temperance, and their 3 grown children, Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy. The Hardens arrived in the spring of 1791, claiming to be refugees from savage Indian raids that had destroyed their Virginia homestead. They quickly became pillars of the community. Ezekiel served as a lay preacher, assisting Reverend Cole, while Temperance organized charity for new settlers who arrived with nothing. Ezekiel Harden was a man who commanded attention the moment he entered a room, tall, broad-shouldered, his booming voice filling the church with fiery sermons that stirred both hope and fear. He preached with the conviction of someone who had seen both heaven and hell firsthand. His wife, Temperance, was the town's healer, a frail-looking woman with gray-streaked hair and an encyclopedic knowledge of herbs. She treated wounds, illnesses, and childbirths with uncanny success. Her reputation for miracles spread far beyond Millfield. Their sons seemed the perfect frontier men. Caleb, the eldest at 26, had his father's strength and his mother's kindness, always willing to lend a hand to struggling neighbors. Josiah, 2 years younger, was the thoughtful one, the community's informal schoolmaster when farm work slowed in winter. And then there was Mercy, just 22, beautiful, kind, and gentle, a young woman adored by everyone who met her. The Harden farm sprawled across 400 acres of rich bottomland along Beaver Creek, 3 miles south of town. Ezekiel had poured every penny into it, and the investment paid off. Their crops flourished, their livestock thrived, and their mill drew settlers from miles around. Visitors often marveled at their success. The Hardens seemed to have more wealth than any ordinary farm could produce. Yet Ezekiel's homestead reflected both prosperity and paranoia, a massive 2-story log house with glass windows, rare on the frontier, and thick stone chimneys built to withstand attack. It was a place that projected strength, piety, and security. But within those walls, behind the facade of Christian virtue and community service, something unspeakable was already unfolding. The Harden farmhouse stood as a symbol of prosperity and grace on the rough Kentucky frontier. Inside, the rooms were furnished with pieces far too fine for a simple farming family: carved oak chairs, imported china, polished silver candlesticks, and shelves lined with well-worn books that spoke of culture and education rarely found beyond the mountains. Outside, the operation was vast. A barn large enough to shelter 50 horses dominated the property, flanked by outbuildings that formed a small village of their own: a smokehouse, a dairy, a blacksmith shop, and what Ezekiel proudly called the largest root cellar in the county. But what truly set the Hardens apart was their reputation for boundless charity. To weary travelers, their farm was a sanctuary in a merciless land where a wrong turn could mean death. Every week, it seemed, someone arrived at their gate: a wagon broken, a horse injured, a family stranded. And without hesitation, Ezekiel would saddle up and ride into the storm, bringing them back to safety. On the frontier, hospitality was more than virtue, it was survival. Yet the Hardens practiced it with a zeal that bordered on saintly. Temperance Harden, with her gentle smile and healer's hands, tended to the sick and wounded regardless of wealth or station. Her infirmary, tucked into one of the side buildings, was astonishing for its time, stocked with instruments and medicines that most physicians on the frontier could only dream of. Travelers spoke her name with reverence. Many claimed they owed their lives to her midnight care and her bitter herbal tonics. By 1798, the family's reputation had spread far beyond Beaver Creek. Word along the Wilderness Road was clear: if you were lost, cold, or injured, the Harden farm was your safest refuge. Local guides even marked it on their maps, and weary travelers deliberately altered their routes to pass through Millfield for a night under the Hardens' roof. Mercy, the youngest of the family, kept a meticulous guest ledger. Each neat line told a story: merchants, ministers, soldiers, and families, hundreds of names over the years, each grateful for food, rest, and safety. But in the wilderness, where danger lurked in every shadow and trust could turn fatal, such perfection often hid something darker. Appearances on the frontier could deceive, and sometimes, they could kill. The illusion began to unravel on October 13, 1798, with the disappearance of a respected merchant named Samuel Fletcher. Fletcher wasn't just another wanderer. He was one of the most reliable traders on the Wilderness Road, a man known for his punctuality and discipline, the kind of man whose clockwork routines had earned him wealth and respect. For 12 years he had made the perilous run between Virginia and Kentucky 4 times a year, hauling manufactured goods west and bringing raw materials back east. So when his business partner, Thomas Greeley, received no word 5 days past Fletcher's expected arrival in Lexington, alarm bells rang. Fletcher never missed a deadline. He never changed plans without sending word. On October 18, Greeley saddled up and began retracing Fletcher's route. He questioned innkeepers, traders, and farmers along the trail. Each one confirmed the same thing: Fletcher had passed through right on schedule, cheerful and in good spirits. The trail was clear until Millfield. Then, nothing. The first sign came 2 days into Greeley's search. Near Miller's Creek, he found Fletcher's distinctive bay mare grazing freely, unharmed and well-fed, the saddle still on her back. Oddly, the bridle had been neatly hung on a tree branch, as though placed there with care. It was no accident. Even stranger, Fletcher's saddlebags were untouched, filled with goods, ledgers, and nearly $50 in silver, a small fortune for the time. Robbery, the usual culprit in such disappearances, could be ruled out immediately. A faint trail of belongings led from the road into the forest, a glove, a ledger page, a broken button, spaced just far enough apart to suggest they'd been dropped in struggle, as if Fletcher had been dragged away, leaving a breadcrumb trail no one was meant to find. The man assigned to investigate was Constable Jacob Winters, a hard, battle-tested veteran who had fought under General Anthony Wayne in the Ohio campaigns. Winters was not easily rattled. He'd seen too much death to be superstitious. But something about this case felt different, deliberate, clean, and wrong. Within hours, he assembled a 12-man search party. Among them was Henrik Johansson, a Swedish tracker said to rival the best native scouts, and Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter who knew every ravine and hollow within 50 miles. Their search followed Fletcher's trail through the thickets and briars, the signs growing fainter but consistent, torn cloth on a thorn bush, droplets of blood darkened by the cold October air. The tracks led straight toward one place, the Harden farm. And then, as if swallowed by the earth, the trail ended. Right at the boundary fence, every trace of Fletcher simply vanished. No footprints. No disturbed earth. No signs of struggle. Even Johansson, who could track a deer through rain, stood silent, baffled. It was as though the merchant had been lifted from the ground by invisible hands and spirited away. When Constable Winters questioned Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch was polite, composed, and strangely prepared. His words came measured, his tone calm. Yes, he said, Fletcher had arrived at the farm just before sunset on October 13th. He'd asked about a shortcut that could save him a day's ride to Lexington. Ezekiel had warned him not to take it, the trails were treacherous, and the weather was turning. But Fletcher insisted. He seemed anxious, even fearful, checking his saddle and glancing behind him as though being followed. Temperance added softly that Fletcher had complained of stomach pain. She'd given him a small bottle of herbal tonic and urged him to stay the night. But he refused, determined to press on before darkness fell. Caleb confirmed that he'd offered to guide Fletcher partway to the Ridge Road, an offer the merchant politely declined. When Winters questioned the rest of the family, each gave the same story, word for word. Their descriptions matched perfectly, the merchant's nervousness, his insistence on leaving, the bottle of medicine, even the way the light had fallen across the yard as he rode away. Their testimony should have comforted the constable. Instead, it chilled him. Too consistent. Too perfect. Almost rehearsed. And as the sun set behind the Harden homestead, casting long shadows across the barnyard, Winters couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel Fletcher had never left that farm alive. Instead, it struck him as too perfect, like a story rehearsed and memorized until every line was fixed in place. Real witnesses, in Winters' experience, always contradicted one another on minor points while agreeing on the major ones. The Harden's version, however, was seamless, too polished, too complete, too free of the small inconsistencies that marked genuine testimony. His unease deepened when he noticed how much the farm itself had changed since his last visit. A massive new smokehouse stood beside the main barn, its stone walls unusually thick for a family operation, more like fortification than food storage. Around several outbuildings, the ground was freshly turned, as if large-scale digging had taken place recently. Most curious of all, the family's root cellar had been enlarged, its entrance now reinforced with new timber beams and wide enough to admit a wagon. When Winters inquired about these improvements, Ezekiel explained that an unusually profitable harvest had allowed the family to reinvest in better storage and preservation facilities. The expanded cellar, he said, was necessary to hold the increased yield they planned to sell in Lexington, and the new smokehouse would enable them to cure meat for both home use and trade. The answers were reasonable, too reasonable. Ezekiel spoke with deliberate precision, as though rehearsing a script rather than offering casual conversation. And beneath the surface civility, Winters sensed a brittle tension. The Hardens' legendary hospitality felt forced, their smiles tight, their laughter hollow. Temperance's hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee. Mercy's eyes flicked constantly toward her father, as if seeking approval for every word she dared speak. Even Caleb and Josiah, usually brash, confident young men, seemed subdued, watchful, and wary. Something was wrong. Winters could feel it in the air, but without tangible proof, the law left him powerless. Fletcher's disappearance was officially recorded as a probable highway robbery or Indian attack, his name added to the ever-growing list of frontier casualties that marked the cost of westward expansion. His horse was auctioned to settle his debts, and within weeks, Samuel Fletcher became another forgotten traveler swallowed by the wilderness. But his case, as it turned out, was only the beginning. Over the next 8 months, a grim pattern emerged, one that would turn a prosperous stretch of Kentucky farmland into a place of whispered warnings and shuttered doors after dark. From the winter of 1798 through the spring of 1799, travelers continued to vanish along the wilderness road with unnerving regularity. Every few weeks, another soul disappeared without trace, merchants, families, even armed groups traveling for safety in numbers. The only common thread was geography, each had been seen heading toward, or inquiring about directions to, the Harden farm before vanishing. Dr. Marcus Cromwell disappeared in November. A 43-year-old physician from Richmond, he was bound for Louisville to establish a new practice, his wagon laden with instruments, books, and supplies worth over $300, a fortune by frontier standards. His overturned wagon was discovered near Devil's Fork, scarcely 3 miles from the Harden property. Its contents were scattered but strangely untouched, except for one item. His medical bag, containing a surgical kit with a bone saw and amputation tools, was missing. No wild animal would have taken such things. And no ordinary thief would have ignored the coins and trade goods still lying in the mud. In December, the Henley family vanished during a blizzard. Jonathan Henley, his wife Elizabeth, and their 2 young children were last seen seeking shelter after their wagon became mired in snow less than half a mile from the Harden farm. According to Ezekiel's statement, they never reached his property and likely froze to death in the storm. Yet when the snow melted, searchers found their wagon had been pulled free from the drift and neatly cleared of snow. Their clothing and personal effects were gone, but their food and tools remained untouched. Most chilling of all, multiple sets of footprints surrounded the wagon, as if several people had labored together in the storm to move it. Then came January, and the disappearance of Reverend Nathan Cross, a traveling preacher known for braving the most perilous regions of the frontier. Cross carried nearly $200 in donations for a new church in Frankfort. His horse was found 3 days later, saddlebags intact, the money untouched. The official verdict was natural causes, a stroke or heart attack, perhaps, but even the most pragmatic settlers whispered their doubts. Each case followed the same macabre rhythm, an abandoned horse grazing by the roadside, scattered belongings hinting at sudden violence, and trails that seemed to lead inevitably toward the Harden land before vanishing altogether. Still, when questioned, the Hardens always offered plausible, measured answers. Yes, they had seen some travelers pass, but only briefly. Yes, they had offered assistance, food, shelter, warnings about storms or bandits, but most declined and rode on, against their advice. Their explanations were consistent, reasonable, and, most damningly, impossible to disprove. Constable Winters found himself caught in a tightening snare of suspicion and helplessness. The Hardens were pillars of the community, Ezekiel a respected lay preacher whose sermons drew crowds from miles around, Temperance a healer revered for her work during the last fever outbreak. To accuse them without proof would mean professional ruin, perhaps worse. On the frontier, reputation was currency, to lose it was to lose everything. And yet, each time Winters rode away from the Harden farm, he felt the same gnawing certainty growing in his chest, that somewhere beneath those newly laid stones, freshly turned earth, and smokehouse walls, the truth waited, silent and buried. The wilderness road had always been perilous, an artery of ambition carved through the wild, where men vanished as easily as morning frost. Bandits haunted its lonely stretches, hostile Indians still defended their ancestral hunting grounds, storms rose without warning from the western plains, and the forests themselves hid more threats than any lawman could count. Dozens of travelers disappeared every year under circumstances far less mysterious than those shadowing the Harden farm. What made this cluster different was not the violence itself but its pattern. Too many victims, too near together, all last seen within shouting distance of the same patch of earth. To some, it was coincidence. To others, superstition. But to Winters, it was mathematics, and mathematics did not lie. Still, in a world where evidence mattered more than intuition, numbers carried no weight. And evidence, solid, physical, undeniable, seemed to evaporate like mist whenever an investigation neared the Harden property. The family welcomed scrutiny with almost theatrical openness. They permitted searches of every building and field, answered questions without hesitation, even joined search parties that combed the wilderness for the missing. Their cooperation was so complete that it began to feel like mockery, a polite, smiling wall of helpfulness that left Winters gnawing his frustration in silence. The first crack in that immaculate facade came from an unlikely source, 9-year-old Timothy Voren, the curious son of a farmer who lived 2 miles east of the Harden homestead. Timothy was known as a dreamer, a wide-eyed explorer of the woods who spun wild tales about bears that talked and rivers that glowed. Few adults took his stories seriously. But one raw March morning in 1799, he approached Constable Winters with a tale that froze the blood in the older man's veins. He claimed that on several nights over the winter, while wandering near Beaver Creek, he had heard screaming from the direction of the Harden property, not the shouts of quarreling settlers or the cries of childbirth, but sustained, unbroken wails that rose and fell in patterns of agony no child should have words for. The sounds came, he said, 5 separate times, always in the darkest hours before dawn, and were sometimes joined by other noises, rhythmic hammering, the squeal of pulleys, the creak of ropes, and once or twice what sounded like voices chanting together in low, steady cadence. Then, suddenly, all would fall silent, as if the night itself had been strangled. When Winters questioned Timothy's parents, they admitted uneasily that they too had heard strange noises on several occasions. But they had dismissed them as the tricks of wind and distance, or the cries of animals distorted by the hollows. After all, the Hardens were good Christian folk, generous, charitable, pillars of the church. What reasonable person would believe otherwise? The constable might have dismissed the boy's story as childish fancy, except for one chilling coincidence. When pressed for details, Timothy recalled the approximate dates of each night's disturbance. Winters cross-checked them against his records, and every single instance aligned exactly with the disappearance of a traveler. The odds of such correspondence by chance were infinitesimal. Armed with the boy's testimony, Winters began building his case the way a mason lays stone, quietly, carefully, piece by piece. He knew accusations against the Hardens would be social suicide without evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. So he worked in secret, visiting nearby homesteads under the pretext of routine patrols, asking careful questions that revealed little of his true purpose. What emerged from these hushed interviews was a patchwork of unsettling fragments, each trivial on its own, but together forming a picture that chilled him to the bone. Sarah Mitchell, whose small farm bordered the Hardens to the west, recalled seeing lanterns moving between their outbuildings at ungodly hours. She had heard digging, hammering, and what she described as the ring of metal against stone long after midnight. When she once mentioned it to Temperance Harden after church, the woman had laughed lightly and explained that the family preferred to work at night during the cooler months, expanding their storage cellars for the coming harvest. The answer had seemed harmless enough, until Sarah realized that the nocturnal labor had continued for months, far longer than any practical construction project should. And oddly, despite all that supposed excavation, she never saw any piles of displaced earth or new foundation stones anywhere on the property. When Winters pressed for detail, Sarah hesitated, then admitted that sometimes, just before dawn, she thought she'd heard muffled cries mixed with the clatter of tools. Then came Henrik Johansson, an aging Swedish settler whose hunting skills were known across 3 counties. His property bordered the Hardens' northern pasture, and his dogs had recently begun digging up bones along the fence line. At first, Johansson assumed they were livestock remains, until he examined them closely. These were not the random leavings of butchered animals. Many had been sawed cleanly through or cracked open with precision, as if harvested for marrow. Some bore scorch marks, as though they'd been boiled. There were skulls, long bones, and fragments Johansson couldn't identify even after a lifetime of butchering. When he brought his findings to Ezekiel Harden, the patriarch offered an easy answer. "Wolves and sickness," he said. A diseased herd had forced them to cull several animals. The remains were scattered in the woods for scavengers. Yet Johansson's keen eyes saw too much order in the supposed chaos, the bones too clean, the cuts too deliberate, the distribution too methodical. He said nothing then, but the images haunted him like unfinished prayers. And as Winters gathered more whispers, a broader unease began to surface. Neighbors noted how the Harden children, once lively and well-liked, had grown withdrawn, their laughter replaced by guarded silence. Caleb and Josiah, formerly bold and talkative, now avoided conversation, their eyes darting like startled deer whenever anyone mentioned the missing travelers. Mercy had become pale and thin, her voice trembling during hymns as though she carried some secret she could no longer bear. Even Temperance herself, once the soul of compassion, seemed cold now, her smiles brittle, her hands trembling during communion as if touched by fever. The pattern was there, lurking beneath the surface of civility like bones beneath soil. And Constable Winters, for all his restraint, knew that the time was coming when polite suspicion would no longer be enough. Mercy Harden's transformation was perhaps the most disturbing of all. Once the county's brightest flower, celebrated for her beauty, wit, and kind-heartedness, she had withered into something hollow and spectral. Her once luminous eyes now carried a distant, hunted look, and her complexion had faded to the gray pallor of perpetual fear. Neighbors whispered that she looked like a woman twice her age. She no longer attended dances, church socials, or quilting circles. On the rare occasions she appeared in public, she kept her head bowed, flinching at even the gentlest touch, as though human contact might expose some unspeakable secret. Ezekiel's sermons, too, had taken a darker and more fanatical turn. Gone were his gentle lessons on mercy and redemption. In their place came fire and brimstone, grim warnings of divine wrath, vivid descriptions of the torments of hell, and furious calls to purge evil wherever it hid. Parishioners left services pale and shaken, some murmuring that the preacher's eyes gleamed like a man possessed. A few confided to Constable Winters that Ezekiel spoke less like a minister of God than an executioner justifying his work. Driven by instinct and now unmistakable dread, Winters began combing through the family's history, and what he found deepened the mystery into something uncanny. The Harden story of being refugees from Indian raids in eastern Virginia fell apart under scrutiny. When the constable wrote to authorities in Richmond and Williamsburg, the replies came back uniformly negative: no records, no witnesses, no trace of any Harden family fitting that description. It was as though they had never existed east of the Appalachian frontier. Moreover, their arrival in Kentucky in the spring of 1791 marked the beginning of their entire recorded existence. There were no letters from relatives, no deeds or bills of sale from their supposed Virginia property, no heirlooms that predated their settlement. Yet, for a family claiming to have fled violence and ruin, they had somehow arrived with expensive furnishings, silver candlesticks, books, and enough wealth to build one of the most prosperous farms in the county. The contradiction gnawed at Winters until it felt like madness. Then, in April of 1799, fate, or perhaps Providence, sent him the final piece of the puzzle. A traveling peddler named Isaac Brewster rode into Millfield carrying rumors that turned suspicion into revelation. Brewster was one of those rare men whose trade made him part merchant, part messenger, and part historian of the wilderness. He knew every road, every settlement, every story that passed along the frontier. And he had just come from eastern Tennessee with tales that chilled the blood. There, along the Holston River Valley between 1789 and 1791, a series of disappearances had plagued travelers, 15 men and women who had vanished near a prosperous homestead owned by a family called Harper. The names and the pattern struck Winters like thunder. The Harpers, Zachariah, his wife Prudence, and their 3 grown children, had been respected pillars of their community. Zachariah was a lay preacher famed for his oratory and his zeal, Prudence, a healer renowned for her herbal knowledge and charitable works. They had claimed to be refugees from Indian raids in Virginia, and, like the Hardens, had opened their doors to travelers with saintly hospitality. Then the disappearances began. Travelers passing through the area were last seen heading toward the Harper place, never to emerge again. Horses turned up wandering loose, possessions scattered, but no bodies, no evidence. The parallels were so precise that Winters felt the hair rise on his arms as Brewster spoke. When suspicion finally fell upon the Harpers, the family vanished overnight. Their homestead was discovered in ruins, wells filled with stones, barns half burned, records destroyed, as though they had systematically erased themselves from existence. Weeks later, authorities searching the property uncovered shallow graves scattered through the woods. Inside were the remains of both animals and humans, the bones of missing travelers mixed together, stripped clean, dismembered, some showing signs of butchery. The discovery confirmed what many had feared: the Harpers had been murderers hiding behind a mask of piety. But by then, they were gone. The manhunt that followed stretched across 6 months in 3 territories but yielded nothing. The Harpers had dissolved into the wilderness, leaving only graves and whispers behind. The case was eventually closed, consigned to rumor and legend, until now. When Brewster described the family in detail, Winters's stomach turned to stone. Zachariah Harper was tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and fierce, intelligent eyes, a perfect likeness of Ezekiel Harden. Prudence Harper was small and fair, with delicate hands and a healer's knowledge, the image of Temperance Harden. Their 3 children, 2 strong young men and a daughter of remarkable beauty, matched Caleb, Josiah, and Mercy in age and appearance with terrifying precision. It was not resemblance. It was identity. The realization hit like a hammer: the Hardens were the Harpers reborn under new names. Murderers who had fled one massacre only to build another. And now, 8 years later, their enterprise had become more sophisticated, more efficient, more monstrous. If Brewster's story was true, the family had refined their methods, eliminating mistakes, concealing evidence, perfecting their deception. What had once been crude opportunistic murder had become an organized system of slaughter and disposal, conducted with ritualistic precision under the guise of Christian charity. The number of victims in Kentucky alone likely surpassed those in Tennessee. The Hardens were not just criminals, they were predators, seasoned and deliberate, who had made murder their vocation. The weight of revelation crushed Constable Winters like an anvil. He had enough testimony to raise an army, but not enough proof to stand before a magistrate. The law required certainty, frontier justice, ironclad evidence. Without it, an accusation of this magnitude would ruin him, and the Hardens would simply vanish again, leaving Kentucky soaked in blood. That proof came from the most unexpected place imaginable. On the storm-lashed night of May 22, 1799, a frantic knocking shook Winters's cabin door. When he opened it, he found Mercy Harden standing in the rain, her dress torn, her face streaked with tears and mud, eyes wide with unrelieved terror. She looked like a ghost dragged from the grave. For a long moment, she could not speak, her entire body trembled as if seized by cold or madness. When at last her voice emerged, it was a broken whisper: "I can't keep silent any longer." For the next 3 hours, Mercy poured out a confession so ghastly that even the battle-hardened constable, who had seen men torn apart by war and beasts alike, felt his soul recoil. According to Mercy, the killings had begun scarcely months after the family's arrival in Kentucky. What Winters had imagined as opportunistic violence was, in fact, a deliberate and ritualized operation, a machinery of death engineered and sanctified by her father's twisted theology. Ezekiel, she said, believed himself an instrument of divine judgment. He had convinced his family that God had chosen them to purge the frontier of the unworthy, the corrupt, the greedy, the faithless who dared to cross wilderness lands without divine sanction. Each traveler they lured, each soul they slaughtered, was, in his words, a sinner offered to the fire for the cleansing of the world. The murders, Mercy confessed, were never crimes of passion or greed. They were rituals, executions masked as divine justice, designed to feed both Ezekiel Harden's delusions of righteousness and the family's growing appetite for wealth. Every killing followed the same precise, methodical process, refined over years of practice until it resembled an unholy sacrament. It began with what the family called the evaluation. When travelers approached the farm, especially those with money, fine horses, or trade goods, Ezekiel would greet them with the warmth of a devout frontier minister. He would ask questions couched in neighborly concern: where they were bound, what work they did, what they believed. Beneath his cordial tone, every word was a test. From these conversations, he judged who among them was worthy of God's mercy, and who deserved divine correction. The judgments were grotesquely predictable. The wealthy were guilty of greed. The educated, of arrogance. Families traveling with children were condemned for endangering innocence. Even ministers could be declared false prophets if their doctrine strayed from Ezekiel's twisted theology. Once he pronounced his invisible sentence, the machinery of death moved into motion. The condemned were invited to stay the night. Ezekiel would speak of robbers on the road, of wild animals, of storms. His reputation for hospitality, his wife's cooking, his children's manners, his sermons, made refusal almost impossible. Guests would sit at the Hardens' table, eating food prepared with the same care and grace shown to visiting preachers or magistrates. Temperance would cook lavishly, roast meats, baked bread, mulled whiskey, while the children played the fiddle or read from Scripture. Then came the final course, coffee or whiskey laced with one of Temperance's special mixtures. She had perfected her concoction over years of practice, a blend of sedative herbs and compounds that mimicked the weariness of travel. Victims grew drowsy, disoriented, their speech slurring as they accepted the family's offer to rest for the journey. They never woke in the sane world again. When consciousness returned, they found themselves bound in the dark, deep beneath the Harden farmhouse. The cellars below the property were no ordinary storage pits but a labyrinth, a warren of chambers and tunnels extending nearly 200 yards beneath the earth. Mercy described them in a trembling voice: narrow corridors of limestone and clay, connected by ladders and steps, some rooms crudely braced with timber, others carved smooth like catacombs. At the heart of this subterranean maze stood Ezekiel's greatest blasphemy, the courtroom. There, lit by oil lamps and torches, he had carved a judge's bench from stone and set iron shackles into the walls. Crosses, Bibles, and verses from Scripture were scrawled across the walls in blood and soot. Here, Ezekiel held his trials. The spectacle mimicked real justice. Prisoners were accused, evidence was presented, and verdicts were read aloud from the pulpit Ezekiel called the bench of God. But the outcomes were fixed before the trials began. Each captive was condemned not for what they had done, but for what Ezekiel believed they represented: sin, pride, heresy, corruption. In his mind, these trials were sacred rituals. By pretending to administer justice rather than murder, Ezekiel convinced himself, and his family, that they were instruments of divine purification, not criminals. It was this theology of death that allowed them to sleep at night, that turned slaughter into sacrament. Punishments varied according to Ezekiel's warped imagination. Some captives were kept alive for weeks or months, forced to work for the family before meeting their fate. Dr. Cromwell, the missing physician from November, had been compelled to teach temperance surgical techniques before he was executed. Reverend Cross, another victim, had been forced to write sermons that Ezekiel later preached as his own. Others died quickly. Thieves were hanged from iron hooks in the ceiling. The proud were drowned in flooded chambers beneath the cellar. And for those Ezekiel deemed especially wicked, wealthy merchants, officials, skeptics, he devised elaborate executions framed as purifications. But Mercy's testimony didn't end with the killings. It revealed a system, a household of murder functioning with the precision of a business. Each family member had a role. Caleb and Josiah, strong and silent, were the enforcers. They captured travelers, carried bodies, and maintained the tunnels. Their brute strength made them invaluable for the endless labor of burial and concealment. Mercy, the daughter, served as the bookkeeper. She kept detailed ledgers in neat handwriting, page after page cataloging each victim like entries in a merchant's account. Names, ages, possessions, manner of death, even final words, all recorded with chilling precision. Temperance, the matriarch, was the most indispensable of all. Her herbal skill and medical knowledge, once used to heal, had become the instruments of control and death. She brewed the drugs, treated wounded captives long enough to extract their labor, and ensured every execution left no trace that could betray them. When prisoners resisted, Temperance applied what she called treatments. They were not punishments in the ordinary sense but experiments, refinements in pain designed to destroy will without causing death. Her victims emerged obedient, broken, and silent. The family's success, Mercy revealed, lay not only in their discipline but in their mastery of concealment. No bodies were buried on the farm itself. Instead, Caleb and Josiah dragged them through the cave tunnels to natural limestone caverns miles from the house. There, the constant moisture and mineral air hastened decay, leaving only bones that would vanish into the rock. Possessions were handled like goods in a trade network. Jewelry, tools, money, and fine clothing were divided, sold, or scattered across distant markets. Less valuable items were placed along roadsides or near streams, deliberate misdirections suggesting robbery or Indian attack. Even the victim's clothing was catalogued and processed, useful garments kept, distinctive ones burned. Every trace of each traveler was methodically erased. Mercy's trembling words painted a portrait of a family transformed into a congregation of killers, a household where prayer opened every murder, where scripture sanctified every crime, and where the name of God was invoked before every act of torture. The Hardens had not merely killed for profit. They had built a religion out of it. The disposal of the horses proved one of the family's most delicate challenges. Horses were valuable, too valuable, and easily recognized by settlers who knew their owners. But the Hardens had thought of everything. Through a network of unscrupulous traders operating in distant counties, they funneled the animals out of Kentucky, selling them hundreds of miles away where no one would ask questions. Each transaction created another false trail, another illusion of travelers who had simply vanished into the wilderness. Perhaps the most ingenious layer of their deception, however, was not in how they hid their crimes, but how they buried them beneath good deeds. Every sermon Ezekiel preached, every wound Temperance healed, every loaf of bread given to a hungry neighbor doubled as both charity and camouflage. Their piety was armor. Their reputation, a fortress. Who could suspect a family so generous during epidemics, so devout in prayer, so seemingly upright in faith? Even their contingency plans revealed a chilling level of foresight. If whispers of suspicion began to spread, they would halt their killings, redouble their benevolence, and drown all doubts beneath acts of public virtue. They had established escape routes through the backwoods and rehearsed how to abandon the farm at a moment's notice, just as they had done when they fled Tennessee 8 years before. But the most disturbing revelation in Mercy's confession concerned the future her father had envisioned. The Hardens were not content to remain a single nest of killers. They were planning an expansion, a network of courts of divine justice scattered across the frontier. Each remote homestead would serve as a new tribunal, a place where Ezekiel's doctrine of purification could spread across Kentucky and beyond. His ambition, Mercy said, was nothing less than to reshape the moral fabric of the frontier through ritualized murder. Mercy's confession was not born from repentance. It was born from terror. Ezekiel's paranoia had deepened in recent months. He had begun to see enemies in every questioning neighbor, every stranger on the road. His new list of the unworthy included Isaac Brewster, the wandering peddler whose curiosity about Tennessee had grown too pointed, and even Constable Winters himself. But what finally drove Mercy to risk everything was her knowledge that 3 living captives still languished beneath the Harden farm. A traveling surveyor named William Patterson had been seized only 3 days earlier and was scheduled to face Ezekiel's trial the following night. 2 others were already imprisoned in the subterranean chambers, Rebecca Foster, a young woman missing for more than a week, and Luther Grimby, an elderly itinerant preacher who had vanished a month earlier. These weren't isolated killings anymore, they were an operation. Mercy's account revealed that the family now held multiple prisoners at once, sorted and scheduled for execution according to an internal calendar of sin and utility. What had begun as sporadic murder had evolved into a production line of death. For Constable Winters, the realization was immediate and crushing. Legal procedure no longer mattered. Every hour lost meant certain death for the captives. Yet a direct assault on the Harden farm was tantamount to suicide. The Hardens were armed, well-prepared, and entrenched on ground they knew better than anyone. Winters wrestled with the impossible choice before him. To ride to Lexington for reinforcements would save his own life but doom the prisoners. To confront the family alone might save the captives, but risk alerting the killers and losing everything. Fate decided for him. He would not act alone. Henrik Johansson, the stoic Swedish farmer and veteran of his homeland's army, volunteered without hesitation. He had suspected the Hardens for months and knew every inch of the forest surrounding their land. His skill as a tracker and his experience in combat made him indispensable. Isaac Brewster stepped forward next, driven by guilt for the Harper case in Tennessee and by a fierce desire to finish what he had failed to expose years ago. Two more men joined them, Benjamin Stokes, a former bounty hunter with a reputation for icy resolve, and Daniel Crawford, a seasoned frontiersman and veteran of the Indian Wars. Together, the 5 men formed a grim fellowship united by duty, outrage, and dread. Their plan was simple, because complexity would only get them killed. Under cover of darkness on the night of May 23, 1799, they would approach the Harden farm from the north, using the tree line and the dry creek beds for concealment. Surprise was their only advantage. Their mission: rescue the captives first, capture the killers if possible, destroy them if necessary. Mercy's terrified cooperation was invaluable. She described the farm's defenses in meticulous detail, the layout of the house, the location of the weapons cache, and, most importantly, the 2 known entrances to the underground chambers. The primary access lay through the enlarged root cellar beneath the main house. The secondary, a narrow tunnel exit concealed in the woods nearly a quarter-mile away, served as the family's emergency escape route. Ezekiel had prepared for this possibility. He had drilled his sons relentlessly, training them to repel intruders long enough for the others to flee through the tunnels. Firearms, ammunition, and supplies were stored at both exits. The Hardens were ready for war. The rescuers set out just before midnight. The sky was moonless, the air heavy with the scent of rain and the whisper of leaves. They moved like hunters, slipping through the underbrush with weapons drawn, their breathing shallow and controlled. Every step toward the Harden property tightened the noose of danger. The last half-mile was open ground, an exposed stretch of meadow that left them vulnerable to detection. Johansson led the way, navigating by starlight and memory, guiding them through gullies and along the banks of Beaver Creek to stay hidden from the house's line of sight. When they finally crested the last ridge, the farm came into view. What they saw froze them in silence. The Hardens' land was a vision of quiet industry gone grotesque. Fresh mounds of earth littered the fields like tumors. Shovels and wheelbarrows stood abandoned beside pits of limestone and clay. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the acrid bite of quicklime, used, Winters knew, to dissolve flesh. The house itself glowed invitingly from within, lamplight spilling from the windows, smoke curling from the chimneys as though the family slept peacefully inside. But from below, beneath the soft music of frogs and night insects, came the sounds that would haunt every man present until the end of his days. Muffled voices. Screams, faint and quickly stifled. And beneath it all, a deep, rhythmic sound, metal striking stone. The Hardens were still working. What awaited below, none of them could yet imagine. But as Winters exchanged a grim glance with Johansson and drew his pistol, he knew one truth beyond doubt. Before dawn, the ground beneath the Harden farm would be opened, and the sins buried there would finally see the light. The rescue began precisely at 2 a.m., when the Hardens were least alert and most vulnerable. Winters and Johansson crept toward the main cellar entrance while Stokes and Crawford flanked the woods to seal off the tunnel escape. Brewster stayed back with the horses, musket ready, his eyes fixed on the dark line of the farmhouse roof. What Mercy had called a simple root cellar was, in truth, a fortress. Hidden firing slits, sandbag emplacements, and interlocking fields of fire revealed years of patient construction. The Hardens had built their sanctuary for exactly this night. But their arrogance was their undoing. After so many years of deception, they had grown careless, lulled by their pious reputation and convinced their secret would never be unearthed. When Winters and Johansson breached the entrance, they found the family utterly unprepared, absorbed in the gruesome ritual of preparing their next victims for execution. The rescue was swift and horrific. William Patterson was discovered chained in a cell scarcely large enough to stand, gaunt but lucid. Rebecca Foster was barely conscious, her body marked by the brutal treatments Temperance had used to break her will. Luther Grimby, the old preacher, lay dying in another cell, whispering fragments of scripture. But the living were only the beginning. As the raiders pressed deeper into the limestone passages, the true magnitude of the Hardens' crimes revealed itself. Entire chambers were filled with the bones of the dead. Torn clothing, trinkets, and boots littered the stone floors like offerings at a shrine. The air was thick with lime and the unmistakable rot of human decay. What they uncovered was no mere burial site, it was an archive of murder. Mercy's handwritten ledgers lay stacked on a table beside the courtroom, each page recording names, possessions, and dates of execution with a merchant's precision. 67 victims over 8 years. And judging from the evidence, many more yet unnamed. Ezekiel's so-called courtroom stood exactly as Mercy had described, a crude judge's bench fashioned from oak, a cross carved into the rock wall, and rows of trophies, scalps, jewelry, and weapons, displayed like relics of conquest. It was a museum of sanctified depravity. When the family realized they were discovered, they chose death over surrender. Gunfire erupted through the stone halls, the echoes rolling like thunder underground. Ezekiel shouted scripture as he fired, his voice rising above the chaos in a frenzied sermon on divine purification. His sons, Caleb and Josiah, fought with the hopeless fury of men already damned, striking from hidden tunnels they had memorized since childhood. For nearly an hour, the cave roared with the clash of steel and the crack of muskets. The raiders advanced room by room, their torches cutting through the blackness, every step a gamble with death. The end came from above. In a final act of destruction, Temperance Harden set fire to the farmhouse, hoping to burn the evidence and collapse the tunnels. The dry timbers caught instantly, flames roaring skyward. Smoke poured into the cave, choking friend and foe alike. Faced with suffocation or surrender, the surviving Hardens laid down their arms. Only Mercy offered herself peacefully. When Winters found her, she was kneeling beside her bed, praying in silence, her face streaked with ash. She had betrayed her family not from repentance, but from terror, knowing that Ezekiel's growing madness would one day turn on her as it had on so many others. The aftermath stunned the frontier. News of the Harden family's capture spread like wildfire through Kentucky and beyond. Communities that had once admired them now whispered their name with dread. Local authorities struggled to process the enormity of the crime. The full excavation of the underground complex revealed something far worse than anyone imagined. The tunnels extended for nearly 2 miles, carved and reinforced to hold dozens of prisoners. Among the remains were objects belonging to travelers long presumed lost, including children's toys and clothing. The implication was unbearable. Whole families had perished here. The Henley family, missing since the Great Blizzard, were among the dead. Records showed they had been held for over a week before execution. Their children, aged 6 and 8, had survived for several days after their parents' deaths, before meeting the same fate deep in the limestone caverns. By the time the cataloging ended, the true number of victims was believed to far exceed Mercy's recorded 67, perhaps well over 100. The trial of the Harden family began in June 1799, drawing crowds from across the territories. The courthouse in Lexington overflowed daily with horrified spectators, grieving families, and legal scholars who recognized the case as the darkest in American history to that point. The evidence was so grotesque that Judge Samuel Whitmore ordered portions of testimony sealed from public record. Throughout the proceedings, Ezekiel Harden remained unrepentant. He refused counsel, using the trial as his pulpit. Each time he was allowed to speak, he delivered manic sermons proclaiming himself the hand of God. Every death, he declared, was holy fire purging sin from this frontier. I am not a murderer, I am judgment made flesh. His words turned the courtroom to stone. Temperance Harden sat motionless beside him, eyes vacant, lips moving in silent prayer. Caleb and Josiah alternated between defiance and despair, their youthful faces twisted by fanaticism. Only Mercy wept openly, though whether for her victims or her soul, no one could tell. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts of murder, conspiracy, and blasphemy, Ezekiel only smiled. You cannot hang the truth, he said quietly. It will rise again. According to Ezekiel Harden's twisted theology, he and his family weren't murderers, they were chosen. In his mind, the Hardens were instruments of divine judgment, appointed by God to purge the frontier of unworthy souls who threatened the moral fabric of Christian civilization. The money and valuables taken from their victims? Not theft, but righteous compensation for holy labor. The sprawling network of limestone tunnels beneath their home? Not a dungeon, but a court of God, where judgment was rendered upon the sinful. It was madness draped in Scripture. During the trial, Ezekiel's wife and sons claimed innocence, insisting they'd been forced to obey under the weight of his religious delusion and violent temper. Temperance Harden wept as she told the court her medical skills were perverted for cruelty, her healing turned to torture. Caleb and Josiah claimed they were soldiers in a holy war, brainwashed into believing every victim was an agent of Satan. But the evidence told another story. Mercy's meticulous ledgers bore multiple handwritings, proof that each family member had kept their own accounts of slaughter. In their rooms, investigators found trophies from victims, jewelry, watches, lockets of hair, even children's toys. They hadn't been coerced. They had enjoyed it. Only Mercy Harden showed genuine remorse. Her confession had cracked the case wide open, but even that had been driven by fear, not conscience. Still, her cooperation spared her the gallows. Judge Samuel Whitmore delivered the sentences without hesitation. Ezekiel, Temperance, Caleb, and Josiah Harden, condemned to death by hanging. Execution date, August 15, 1799, exactly 1 year to the day since Samuel Fletcher's disappearance first exposed the family's crimes. Mercy Harden was sentenced to life imprisonment, 43 years behind the walls of the Kentucky State Penitentiary, where she would die in silence, the last living fragment of the Harden name. When the day of execution came, more than 4,000 people crowded the fields outside Lexington, the largest gathering in Kentucky's history at that time. Vendors sold pies, whiskey, and cornmeal cakes. Children perched on wagon wheels. Ministers read aloud from the Book of Proverbs. It was part carnival, part reckoning, and no one wanted to miss it. As Ezekiel was led to the gallows, he looked not at the crowd but at the sky. His face was gaunt but calm, eyes gleaming with the same fever that had once filled his sermons. He raised his voice one last time. You think you hang a man, but you hang the hand of God. You will see the punishment of Kentucky. You will drown in sin. The rope snapped taut, cutting his prophecy short. Temperance followed in silence, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Caleb and Josiah offered no words at all. Their bodies swung beside their fathers as the crowd watched in stunned quiet. That morning marked the end of the frontier's most notorious family of killers. Afterward, the Harden farm was burned to the ground, every board, every stone reduced to ash. Townspeople gathered to watch the smoke curl into the sky, a cleansing pyre for the souls buried beneath. Then, under orders from Judge Whitmore, the underground chambers were sealed with gunpowder and rock, entombing the dead in a final act of justice. Local leaders declared the land cursed. No one was ever permitted to build there again. But the legacy of the Harden family didn't die with them. Their case reshaped the frontier's understanding of trust, justice, and faith. New laws were written, property buyers would face background checks, missing persons reports would be standardized, and courts could now rely on circumstantial evidence, reforms that echoed across the early American territories. Most hauntingly, the Harden case exposed how easily evil could hide behind virtue. How good Christian families could mask the darkest crimes beneath piety and respectability. Communities across the frontier began to look differently at their neighbors. Hospitality, once sacred, now carried an edge of suspicion. The official records of the case were sealed in 1801, their contents deemed too disturbing for public release. For nearly 2 centuries, the true story of the Hardens vanished into whispers and folklore. Locals spoke vaguely of the cursed farm on Beaver Creek, but few remembered details. By the mid-1800s, even the location of the homestead was uncertain, swallowed by forest and time. Only a handful of elders could point to where the house once stood. Then, in 1987, the case files were rediscovered, forgotten in a courthouse archive. For the first time, historians pieced together the full horror of Kentucky's first family of serial killers. Even today, not all of it has been revealed. The cave system where the Hardens disposed of their victims has never been fully explored. Some tunnels run so deep and unstable that investigators refuse to enter. Modern forensic technology could uncover the remaining secrets, but local officials prefer to leave the ground undisturbed. Some things, one sheriff said, are better left buried. Still, questions linger. How many travelers vanished without trace across the frontier? How many families, outwardly virtuous, hid the same rot beneath their polished image? Statistical patterns of frontier disappearances suggest that the Hardens were not alone. Similar clusters have been found in Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia, each near families once praised for their charity and faith. Coincidence, or something darker? The answers died with Ezekiel Harden on that August morning in 1799. But his story remains a chilling reminder that evil rarely looks like evil. It smiles. It prays. It offers you a warm meal and a place to rest before nightfall. And by morning, it's too late. If this story left you unsettled, share it. Do you believe everything about the Harden family has been revealed? Or could even darker truths still lie buried beneath the Kentucky soil? Leave your theories in the comments. And if you crave more real-life horror stories from America's forgotten past, subscribe, tap the notification bell, and join us next time as we uncover another tale that blurs the line between faith, madness, and murder.